Welcome to Human Monsters. Greetings, my fellow friends and fiends of the forbidden, the strange, and the unusual. As always, we would like to thank you for the wonderful support you show us on all the platforms. The YouTube channel is growing, and I can tell on the social media sites that we have devoted followers who enjoy the tales of the bizarre stories about criminals we tell on a weekly basis. I want you to know we truly value your support, and to the trolls out there, all I have to say is this: get out of your mom's basement, lose your virginity, get a job, take a shower, get some real-life friends, and touch some grass, because in our reality, your negative comments say more about you than it says about the show. If you are an old true crime sloth like we are, you know rape is more about power than it is about sex. In the MSD manual, it's estimated that about 10% of rapists are in fact sexual sadists. But those who rape and commit homicide are almost 75% sexual sadists. Needless to say, the overwhelming majority of these villains are all male. Sexual sadism is an infliction of physical or psychological suffering, humiliation, or terror on another person to stimulate sexual excitement and orgasm. Sexual sadism disorder is sexual sadism that causes clinically significant distress or functional impairment, or is acted on with a non-consenting person. People with sexual sadism disorder have either acted on the intense urges or have debilitating or distressing fantasies with sexually sadistic themes that they have not acted upon. The condition must also have been present for at least 6 months. Sexual sadism is a form of paraphilia, but mild sadistic sexual behavior is a common sexual practice between consenting adults that is usually limited in scope, is practiced in a way that does not cause harm, and does not meet the clinical criteria for a paraphilic disorder. However, in some people, the behaviors escalate to the point of harm. Determining when sadism becomes pathological is a matter of degree. Most sexual sadists have persistent fantasies in which sexual excitement results from suffering inflicted on the partner, consenting or not. When practiced with no consenting partners, sexual sadism constitutes criminal activity and is likely to continue until the sadist is apprehended. However, sexual sadism is not synonymous with rape. It is a complex amalgam of coerced sex and power exerted over the victim. Sexual sadism is diagnosed in 10% of rapists, but is present in 37 to 75% of people who have committed sexually motivated homicides. Sexual sadism is particularly dangerous when associated with antisocial personality disorder. This combination of disorders may result in criminal sadism involving kidnapping or abduction of unwilling parties who may be harmed or killed. Individuals with both conditions are considered particularly recalcitrant to psychiatric treatment. Such individuals, when apprehended and convicted, are sometimes civilly committed as sexually violent predators for decades due to the lack of effective treatments. The specific clinical criteria follow. Patients derive recurrent and intense sexual arousal from from the physical or psychological suffering of another person. Arousal is expressed in fantasies, intense urges, or behaviors. Patients have acted on their urges with a non-consenting person, or these fantasies or urges cause clinically significant distress or impair functioning at work, in social situations, or other important areas of their lives. The condition has been present for 6 months. The clinician must specify whether the patient is living in a controlled environment, example, prison or institution, or in full remission, i.e., has not acted on their urges with a non-consenting partner, and there has been no distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning for at least 5 years in an uncontrolled environment. Sexual sadism disorder may be diagnosed in patients who deny that they have fantasies or urges related to sexual arousal triggered by the pain or suffering of others. Especially if these patients report multiple sexual episodes of inflicting pain or suffering on a non-consenting person. My personal opinion is that even with chemical or natural castration, it's a condition that is not reversible, and that once a sexual sadist has tasted the ecstasy and euphoria that accompanies this disorder, he will continue to feel the urge to hurt, rape, and even kill. In today's episode, I am going to tell you about 2 sexual sadists who were lesser known and whose actions, one way or another, never really made profound headlines, despite the awful nature of their deeds. For the first example, we will go visit the sunny coast of South Africa, where it's estimated that there is currently no less than 3 active serial killers operating in and amongst the borders of the country. The Sunday Killer. The best way for me to describe the country of South Africa is to ask you to imagine buying a piece of fruit in an open market. It could be a mango or a peach or even a delicious watermelon. On the outside, the fruit looks beautiful and ripe and almost irresistible to eat on the spot. But when you get home and start to peel it or cut into it, you realize the flesh inside is rotten, and suddenly your nostrils are not filled with the delightful scent of sunshine, but the stench of decaying flesh, in which worms and larvae had already begun to burrow. This might be a harsh metaphor to explain the country of South Africa, but this is not only the statistics I am telling you, but a first-hand account of someone who lives there. Despite what travelers' websites, tour brochures, and postcards portray, the breathtaking landscapes and magnificent views belie an undercurrent that statistics only partially reveal. It's the 3rd most dangerous country in the entire world, and the infrastructure is and has been collapsing for almost 3 decades. Random power blackouts last sometimes for days, sometimes for hours, and sometimes even for weeks. There are 55 million people and only about 17,000 active boots on the ground that are police officers, according to Dr. Gerhard Lasagny, who is a renowned profiler. Some still have the passion for the calling that pays very little, but a large majority is corrupt, which seems to be the trend in all the departments of government and parastates. It's an open secret that to get a car or bike license or to get out of a traffic fine, all it takes is a couple of bucks to grease a palm and you are on your way. Syndicates and gangs appear to have the upper hand, and those in charge are completely out of touch with this tragic and desperate state of affairs. 33% of people who are able to work are unemployed, and about 45% of South Africans go to sleep hungry. One of the easiest ways to lure victims for a sexual sadist is to just tell them you have a lead for a job. In South Africa, about 40% of women will be raped in their lifetime. But that statistic is not reliable because it's estimated that only 1 in 9 rapes are reported. Even if a woman follows through with the harrowing ordeal of reporting the rape, going through hours of examinations and invasion of privacy, and facing her perpetrator in court, only 14% of rapists are convicted. There is no middle class, and the life of a poor person has almost no value. The murder rate has escalated from 53 people per day in 2021 to 81 in 2024. Crime and the methods of avoiding becoming a victim is a daily concern, and most of the people of the country have PTSD as a result of the rising violence, theft, murders, and other crimes, which are often only committed because people are hungry and they need to feed their families. You can imagine how little response there is when a person goes missing. A form is completed and the piece of paper is just added to a pile until the murder squad detectives or the coroner's office asks if there is a missing persons form that fits the description of a corpse. Last year, almost 400 people were killed by mob justice or jungle justice. Because the communities know the chances of the law taking its course is not good. You can hire a hitman for 5,000 Rand, which is about $270. And you can, in certain areas, actually rent an AK-47 for 250 Rand, which is about $15 a day in the United States. As I mentioned before, lack of work is one of the main causes of people committing crime. Many women find themselves in a position where they have no other option other than to sell their bodies for money. It's estimated that, according to a survey done by the National Institution of Health in South Africa, that almost 1% of all women in the country do sex work in one form or another to keep their children fed. There is no financial security, and they face contracting lethal diseases such as HIV, and are also subjected to violence, trafficking, and many succumb to substance abuse to deal with the circumstances and challenge this line of work presents. But they do it because they honestly have no other choice. In 2022, the city of Johannesburg was once again aware of how prevalent killers were when a 21-year-old man by the name of Sufis Mikwanzi was arrested for the murder of 6 women, of which 2 were pregnant. All 6 were sex workers, and all were, according to our sources, foreign nationals. Sadly, only 3 of these women would eventually be identified, and even now, after his sentence, their names are still unknown. Sufis was dubbed the Sunday serial killer by the media, purely because authorities first became aware of his crimes on a Sunday. He had hidden the bodies of the 6 women in his father's panel beating shop, which is a huge warehouse. The images police officers encountered that day were so harrowing that it would undoubtedly remain etched in their psyches forever. The case was unusual because in South Africa, there is not often the kind of sex worker murders that you find in the United States. You can just offer those jobs a place to stay or food, and a victim will be so desperate that they will follow a killer anywhere. Another separation from other serial killer murders is that there was no investigation of any kind. He was also younger than the normal serial killer that is identified in South Africa, and he came from a family that was better off than most in the country. Sufi's father had the panel beating shop downtown in Johannesburg, as well as a warehouse, which gave him access to different vehicles whenever he needed them. As he was held in Sun City, which is a general holding cell for trial awaiting prisoners, Dr. Gerhard Luxagny had an opportunity to speak to him. Think of one of the levels of hell, and you will have a good idea of what the conditions for prisoners are in one of these cells. Cells made for 4 sometimes have to house 25 people, and the prisoners are often mentally ill and transient. There is nothing to do, and the 2 meals a day you receive are so little and devoid of nutrition that most prisoners go to sleep hungry. There is limited access to services, and with the backlog of cases, chances are, if you are not able to pay bail or not granted bail, you might be there for months or even years. During his interview, Sufis never expressed being treated badly, which more than likely is as a result of his reputation as a serial killer. Dr. Luxagny described him during the 2-hour interview as an average and unassuming young man of average height. His father, who is a Muslim from Uganda, is a polygamist, which is legal in South Africa, as it is in most African countries. Sufis' mother was a coal woman from Soweto, and for the first 10 years of his life, he would live with his mother and his sister in Soweto. Sufis only got to really know his father from about 2012, when he went to visit him on occasion. Sufis' mother died in 2017 from a heart attack, and his father invited him to come and live with him and work with him in the workshop he owned. Sufis was placed into a Muslim school with a strict religious curriculum and no secular subjects. When COVID struck in 2020 and all school activities stopped, Sufis moved in with his father, and he started to work on a more full-time basis with his father. His father had another wife as well as a 5-year-old daughter, and his father had 2 children who were also much younger, with another lady in Fordsburg, and his father had another wife from Tanzania, with whom he had an unspecified amount of children. No one could recall any behavioral problems with Sufis, and he grew up normal, or as normal as one can grow up, in such a big extended family. The first time real problems with Sufis occurred was in 2021, when he was arrested for the rape of a sex worker. According to him, he picked up the woman and took her to his father's workshop while it was closed. According to him, the incident happened in June, and 2 days after the transaction, 2 officers arrived at his place of work and arrested him for rape. He had apparently not paid her more than she wanted, so she went and made a case against him at the police station. According to him, he did pay her, but she wanted more than the agreed-upon price, and that is why she made the rape claim. Unsure whom to believe, Sufis was locked up in the Sun City. Sufis was locked up in Sun City, along with the other awaiting trial members for 10 months, because the wheels of justice move incredibly slow in South Africa. 10 months later, the case was withdrawn and he was released. But as he was held for this incredibly long time, he started to stew, and hatred for sex workers started to build up. The woman who had made the claim was not the first sex worker he had used, but the detention unleashed something inside of him that he just could not control. He had been picking up sex workers about 3 or so times a year. for the 3 years preceding his arrest. Sufis claim that, because of religious reasons, he had never had a girlfriend. He claimed that the first murder was during Eid in 2021, which meant it happened on the 12th of May. He specifically remembered the family had a function that day, and he excused himself with the excuse of fetching something from the workshop. This implicates that he had only been released for a month before he committed the first murder. On Sunday, the 9th of October, 2022, the caretaker, who is only referred to as Damien, arrives at the warehouse with his 4-year-old son to wash his car at 8 a.m. He greeted the security guard as usual. He began looking for what he needed to wash his car and opened the first door on the first floor, which is usually vacant, and he was hit with the unforgettable smell of decomposition. The first door was covered in darkness, and Damien decided to find the source of the smell. It's when he opened the third door that the smell became completely overwhelming. He decided to use the flashlight on his phone, and there in front of him was the decomposing body of a woman. Damien immediately called the security guard, and they called Sufis' father because he was the tenant and the owner of the building. It would later emerge that the body had been there since the 2nd of October, and it was Sufis' last victim. The heat in South Africa had done its job, and the gore had already started to seep into the flooring. The body was bloated and surrounded with viscera. Sadly, the woman was pregnant, and her body was at an advanced stage of decomposition. Sufis' father was no fool. He knew about his son's previous arrest and that he was one of the few people who had access to this part of the building. The security guard told his father that his son often brought sex workers to the workshop on a Sunday. His father and one of the members of the security firm decided that they needed to find his son. His father phoned Sufis and told him that he was at the workshop and that he needed the keys in Sufis' possession. Sufis did show up, but he could feel something was up and he tried to run away, but he was quickly caught and detained. He first denied that he was at the workshop on the day the security guard said, but when the police arrived and the camera footage showed clearly that he had entered the workshop and left alone, he knew he was caught. In the video, it showed clearly that he had left in one of the cars on the lot and returned an hour later with a woman, but because of load shedding or a blackout, no further footage is available in what has become to be known as Room 3. As the forensics had wrapped up, statements had been taken and the police had left the scene. Sufis' father needed to go to the toilet. As he walked past an old massive air conditioning vent, he came across another body underneath the piece of equipment. His father had to call the police back, and I want people to remember it's a massive building, and the bodies were hidden in several different places. After the discovery of the 2 bodies was made, a full-on search was launched, and another 4 bodies of women were discovered in different areas of the property. It's almost unimaginable that the smell alone would not have given the crimes away. But when one of the cleaners complained about the smell, her concerns were just brushed away. It was downtown Johannesburg after all, and putrid smells were everywhere. 2 of the women's bodies were found in those big dustbins, or wheelie bubs as they are known in South Africa, and 2 were found in cars that had been brought in to be repaired, but whose owners just never came back to collect them. One of the sex workers he picked up and took to the warehouse got undressed, but Sufi saw that she had some kind of oozing sores on her and told her to get dressed again. He paid her and took her back to where he found her without incident. According to Sufis, it was only after the deed or transaction was done and the payment made and the woman demanded more money or threatened to lay a charge of rape against him that he would think back on those 10 months he spent in jail for nothing and his anger would take over. He would take them in a chokehold with his arm until they died. If they did not argue about the money, they would walk out of there and would never know how close they came to being killed. According to him, all the ones who died were the ones who threatened him with an allegation of rape or wanted more money. Dr. Lebas-Sagni feels that the explanations fall a bit short as to the motive for the murders. Strangling is an intimate act, and that he had created a form of moral justice to kill these women. He murdered 6 women over 6 months, of which 2 were pregnant, and he would have undoubtedly found a reason to kill again. He would not have stopped until he was caught. During his trial, the excuse Sufis made was rejected, since all the victims were gagged and their arms and legs bound. The judge speculated that the victims were held to be raped and then to be murdered. Only 3 of the bodies could be identified due to the state of decomposition to the others. They were Chiai Nais, Patricia Magalia, and Hoke Mayo. It's a tragic fact that 50% of sex workers who die and are murdered in South Africa, and that so many remain unnamed. The trial has so far been postponed. Part 2, Richard Byrd. This is the case of Richard Byrd, who must be one of the strangest killers, as well as the lesser-known serial killers in American history. This is because his crimes were brought to light during the 9/11 attacks, when that story obviously dominated the headlines. He was born in Winnemucca, Nevada, and would be an odd child and man all his life. He would eventually confess to killing 8 victims, but the true body count, including that of a classmate, will never really be known. The reason his crimes never hit the headlines is, as I said, because a much more dramatic and tragic event would overshadow his deviant deeds. But Richard Byrd is undoubtedly one of the most bizarre and prolific sexual sadists the United States of America has ever produced. His murder spree would last from March 1991 to the 11th of September 2001, when he was arrested. And yes, that was the day the worst terrorist attack in the country's history would happen, which is why his arrest was hardly noticed. He would officially be arrested a day after the terrorist attacks, and he pled guilty to avoid a trial, and thus one of the most notorious killers would just become a mention in the criminal history books. Did you know that in the state of Nevada, sex work is legal in certain parts in one form or another? 10 out of the 17 counties allow sex work, but not in all municipalities. It's of course legal in Las Vegas, Reno, and Carson City. Still, in these cities, more money is spent on illegal prostitution than legal prostitution in brothels. About 90% of illegal sex work in Las Vegas happens along the strip where the casinos are. Hundreds are arrested on the regular, but since it's just a misdemeanor, the fines are low enough that the ladies of the night hardly have to spend any time in the holding cells. We can go on and on about the morality and legality about this centuries-old profession, but the truth of the matter is that it's been around since the beginning of time, and will continue to as long as there is a market, because men get horny and families need to be fed. Hell, it's not even exclusive to our species. Monkeys have been observed trading sex for food. I doubt any 6-year-old little girl dreams of becoming a sex worker, so put your judgment in your back pocket, because until you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes, you have no idea how you'll handle a situation. Enough about that. let me tell you about one of the most disturbing serial killers I've ever researched and the fucked up way he died. Richard Henry Byrd was born on the 11th of November 1957 in Wanamaker, Nevada, to blackjack dealer Elisha Byrd and a cocktail waitress Phyllis Holden. He was the second child of a couple who had a 19-year age gap between them. Their eldest was a daughter called Peggy Sue, and she was 3 years older than her brother Richard when her father was 36 years old and her mother was only 17 years old. 3 years after Richard was born, the third child, Barbara, was born. Richard's father claimed to be a war hero, but years later this was proven to be a huge lie he told his family. At the time he married Richard's mother, he was still married to another woman who was waiting for him to finish a 12-year prison sentence for beating a teenage sex worker nearly to death in Jacksonville. Richard's father had a substantial record, from soliciting sex work to theft, and very few of what he told friends and those he had married and relationships with was true. After he was released from prison, he never saw his wife again and set out west to make a new life for himself. As Richard's father bounced around, he continued committing petty theft and took up odd jobs to sustain himself, but he always had a taste for sex workers. Richard's parents never legally got married, but she took his name in public. Phyllis came from a dysfunctional family with the kind of father that would have been better off out of the picture. Wanamaker is not a big town with about 10,000 people living there, and since it's the desert, you can imagine it's not the most scenic place to raise a family. It has a real Wild West feel to it, with cow farming still the main form of income. Phyllis was born in the small town and was one of 6 children. Her father, Jack, would be arrested in 1961 for the rape of an underage girl, and his wife, Lois, would divorce him when he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the crime. Rumors revealed that Jack molested Phyllis and her sisters, and Phyllis would quit school in her sophomore years after she fell pregnant and gave the baby up for adoption. There was speculation that the baby's father was, as a matter of fact, her own father. She moved with her mother to Reno and first began to waitress, but soon found work as a cocktail waitress in one of the local casinos. She eventually went back to Wanamaker, where she met Richard's father. Richard's father met Phyllis when she was 16, and soon she was pregnant. The family grew quickly, and the 3 children and 2 adults would share a 2-bedroom home for years. Phyllis realized soon her husband was not going to be a good provider, so she started working in strip clubs. Keep in mind, it was the early 60s, and even I struggle to imagine what a strip club during this time must have been like. While little Richard is going to kindergarten, Mom is stripping in the evenings, and by now Dad had lost his job at the blackjack tables. He was caught running scams with some of the regular players, and instead of having him arrested, they decided to handle the matter internally. He got a righteous beating and would have a limp for the rest of his life. For a while, Richard's father took a job as a bartender at the Black Pearl, where his wife was a dancer, until he pulled a gun on a customer and was fired. He took odd jobs here and there, but eventually pushed Phyllis into doing sex work. By now, he was sexually and physically abusive at home for reasons such as that she was enjoying her work a little too much. When Richard is either 9 or 10 years old, he was moved into the outside shed. Peggy Sue caught her brother more than once standing outside their parents' bedroom, watching them have sex. Then she caught him one night as she was waking up, playing with his penis while standing over her. Phyllis gave him a beating with a paddle, and Richard could not sit down for a couple of days. Thus, an uninsulated shed became his bedroom, and no one spoke to him about how wrong he was to do what he did. The desert is an unforgiving place to live, with sky-high temperatures during the day and freezing temperatures during the night. Richard would later say that the beating he got from his mother might have caused him to not be able to sit down for a while, but it gave him the most magnificent hard-on he had ever had. He would continue to sneak into the house to watch his parents have sex or to watch his sisters or mom get out of the shower. He would get a beating once again if caught, but this just heightened his libido. He would often actually come while he was being beaten. In 1964, when Richard was in the second grade, he would grab girls' private parts and claim it was an accident. In class, he would play with his dick and balls, as if it was just a normal action little boys in school did. In 1968, 3 years later, Richard was caught hiding in one of the girls' bathroom stalls, beating off. He got paddled again, was threatened with getting kicked out of school, and was suspended for a while. His father beat him with a belt so hard that it drew blood, and also locked him in the shed for 3 days without food or water. At one point, while being locked up, he screamed to be let out, but his father just went in there, beat him to a pulp with his fist, and locked him up again. Richard tried his best to appear normal from this point on, but the damage was done. He would sneak out at night from his shed to a young woman's home his mother worked with a couple of houses away, and he would resume his peeping Tom behavior when she brought lovers home, especially when she left the lights on in her house. He would climb up into a tree from where he would have the perfect view to watch and beat off as the unsuspecting lovers had sex. Since balancing on a tree branch, winking and beating you from behind would be too difficult, he stole a hairbrush from his sister's room and stuck it into his asshole. In 1971, Richard's father just vanished off the face of the earth. Rumor has it that he got a bit rough with some girls at the strip club and ended up being buried in the desert. He was notorious for using his wife's money, going to the brothel where she worked, and hiring sex workers for himself. Rumors also had it that he had gotten into debt with the mob for sports betting, and the mob, feeling they were not going to get their money back ever, decided to get rid of the problem for once and for all. Phyllis not only realized after declaring him missing that he was never divorced, but that he had never spent a day in the army, was no war hero, and had left her with nothing except his bad reputation and debts. In late 1972, Phyllis, at the age of 34 years old, retired from sex work and legally married. Richard once again was allowed in the home, but one morning his sister Peggy Sue woke up to feel the sticky residue that could only be cum in her hair. He was still in the room, and as he turned to run, she saw, sticking out of his butt, an old hairbrush that she thought she had lost years ago. His mother ran into his room with a gun and threatened to shoot him if he ever did something like that again, which seemed to work, but no further reports of his vile antics are reported in the home. At school, he was not doing well. He had no friends and was held back in the 8th grade. He managed to get the nickname Dick Turf, and this name would stick till the end of his school career. At school, he was an open pervert. staring down the tops of girls or blatantly trying to see under their dresses. In the fall of 1975, when Richard was 15 years old, a local girl by the name of Tina Hoffman, who was described as a shy and sweet girl, went missing. The 14-year-old girl's body would be found years later in a shallow grave in the desert, and although he will never confess to the murder, Richard was and still remains the prime suspect. She vanished in the middle of the night and only lived 7 houses down from where the Bird family lived. Phyllis married Wayne Morgan, who seemed to be a good and solid man. He was a big guy with a big smile that missed 2 front teeth, but he was kind and friendly. He was a miner and loved Phyllis with all his heart. Peggy Sue later said that she felt safe moving out and getting married because despite his mild demeanor, anyone could see that looking for trouble with the 6'4" and 300-pound man would be a mistake. In 1977, Richard barely graduates high school, and no one had anything good to say about him. Teachers claimed to be afraid of him, especially after Tina went missing. Everyone felt that Richard Bird would go on to do bad things. While he was still in school, he had a job at a grocery store. Although the owner never had a problem with him, he made the female clientele feel uncomfortable by staring at them, and women's lotions and hairbrushes kept on disappearing. In 1977, Wayne used his connections to get Richard a job at a mine. He worked in the mining tunnel for 16 years, and so far, no other murders were connected to him. There were, however, reports from women about a man in a tree watching them as they undress, but he was never caught. He was picked up for loitering in an alley once, and a few women would go missing, but no evidence directly pointed to Dick Turf as the perpetrator. Elko was a small mining town, used mostly for its railway station. It's a city that is renowned for its gold mining, and as with all mining towns, it had its fair share of brothels, and Richards was the Desert Rose. For the first 2 years there, he lived a solitary life in a small apartment, and he finally made a friend by the name of Floyd Birch. Floyd and Richard used to bunk together during the week, and they both liked to spend their money at the Desert Rose. One woman who called herself Jasmine, but whose real name was April Beasley, was Richard's favorite. Other strippers called him Chester the Molester because of his dead eyes and because he freaked them out. With his bowl haircut, awkward mustache, and beady eye, he also dressed and smelled bad. Sex workers insisted that he showered before they committed the act. Richard had a specific fantasy. He wanted 2 girls, but one should be pretending to be asleep. He would pay extra if he could have one of her hairbrushes to stick in his butt as he was jerking off over her sleeping body. The sleeping girl was then supposed to wake up as he came on her and start yelling at him, as the second girl would enter with a wooden spatula, and she was supposed to scream at him too. Management had to tell them to quiet down a couple of times, but the second girl was supposed to take off his pants and yell at him as she spanked him. This would make him come again. The only girl he never asked to act out this fantasy was April, or Jasmine as she was known in the club. April was a small girl of about 5 feet who wore her hair in a pixie cut. She had a thin frame and could not have weighed more than 100 pounds. Without makeup, she looked about 12 years old. With April, Richard wanted her to lie on the bed with him and talk about their day as if they were girlfriend and boyfriend. He would either climax quickly when inside her, or, If he climaxed before he entered her, he would get really angry and start to hit himself. He asked her a couple of times for a real date, but his outbursts at his premature ejaculation and his dodgy eyes persuaded her to always say no. He would get very angry if she did not want to give him her private number and would stop coming to the club for a while. Once he waited for her in his car in the parking lot. April called security and he was banned for good. Her disappearance 6 months later would never be proven but linked to him. According to Floyd, Richard was with him that evening in August 1982. A few co-workers would note scratches on his face the day after she disappeared, but still no direct evidence would link him to her disappearance. The relationship between Richard and Floyd would sour during this time, and a couple of years later, Floyd would die from a tunnel collapse in a mine. Richard continued to do the rounds of the brothels with the same fantasy as before. He continued to write letters to his mother and even told her that he was engaged. He found the address of a girl on the back of a porno magazine, and the two began communicating. He found her name in what is now known as a mail-order bride catalog. He met Wan He Yang, who will later go by the name Sunny Douglas. Sunny had a very hard life herself. She was born in 1965 and given up by her mother for adoption. Sunny believed her mother was also a sex worker and her father one of her mother's clients. In the city of Seoul, in Korea, life was extremely hard, and Sunny was sent to an orphanage. By the time she was 14 years old, she was living on her own and doing odd jobs, such as cleaning houses to put food in her belly. She also sold trinkets or worked in the fish market to make rent. When she was 16 years old, she married a young man, but he was shortly after the union killed in a freak work accident. Sunny was a beautiful young woman and soon was approached by a woman who promised that she could broker a marriage between her and a man from another country who would be able to take care of her. Sunny took some photographs and soon she began to write to Richard Byrd, of all people. He wrote in an almost childlike manner, but despite his juvenile letters, Sunny needed to start over and was won over. She agreed to marry him despite his demands for sex many times a day. Sunny arrived in Nevada on the 9th of September 1985 and would later admit she was disappointed when she saw the skinny and bedraggled man holding her name. She would marry him but would move out within a year into her own apartment, although their tax records stated they lived together. Sunny said the main reason she moved out was that she felt like a sex doll instead of a wife. In the beginning, he tried to be gallant and took her to restaurants, but he suffered from premature ejaculation or could not perform at all, and when this happened, he would leave the room, argue with himself, and she could hear him hit himself. She would also notice marks on his butt and his back, but within a month of living together, he started with his bizarre fantasy where Sunny was supposed to pretend to be his sister, sleeping as he sneaked in and jerked off all over her. Once again, the hairbrush makes its appearance, and after a couple of months, Richard asks Sunny if he can bring another woman into the relationship. He also wants her to spank him, which she does, but she is increasingly feeling uncomfortable. Sunny was specifically not inclined to having another woman in the bedroom. One night, as she refuses, Richard slaps her across the face. He then raped and strangled her. She fought back, and he found himself more excited than ever before. He climaxed and then insisted Sunny spank him hard, which she did because she was terrified. After the attack, He acted as if nothing brutal and violent just happened, and unfortunately for Sunny, this scenario would happen again and again until she left. Sunny started to work on an exit plan, and the moment she had her citizenship, her own job, and her own place, she put Dick Turf in the rearview mirror and moved on with her life. After her divorce from Richard, she moved over to Las Vegas and became a crap dealer in one of the casinos. Richard was furious. He continued to visit brothels and bitched about how awful his wife was and how terrible his childhood was. His anger caused him to become more violent with the sex workers he hired, and that caused him to be banned from most of them. In the summer of 1991, Richard's anger towards Sunny reaches a climax. All he knew was that she was working in a casino in Las Vegas. He now has a new obsession: to find, kidnap, rape, torture, and kill Sunny. He quit his job and moved to Las Vegas with the pure intention of finding her. Before he left, there had been numerous reports of a man outside the windows of women masturbating and watching them with their partners. In the fall of 1991, Richard moved into an apartment block not far from the Durango Strip. He found himself a job as a forklift operator for a soft drink company, and he would work there up until his arrest. He was described as odd, but never called in sick and never missed a shift. The only problem they had with him was his hygiene, because he constantly had that smell of spilled semen on him, like body odor or pancake batter. His neighbors said he was creepy and greasy, had no friends, and he stank. Within 6 months, his murder spree would begin. On the 13th of March, 1991, the body of Alicia Mitchell was found under some construction debris. She had been raped and strangled, and semen was found in her hair. The 23-year-old woman was a runaway from Nebraska. She had aspirations of becoming a singer, but had fallen in with the wrong crowd and got addicted to meth. At the age of 18 years old, she met a boyfriend, moved to Vegas, and soon the boyfriend became a pimp. Richard picked her up outside the Flamingo Club in his 1978 Suburban. She apparently refused to let him choke her, which infuriated him, and he penetrated her while she was screaming. He once again jerked off over her after dumping her body at the construction site. On the 3rd of June 1991, Richard finally caught sight of her as he went out to grab a bite to eat. The moment she saw him, she went pale. She said nothing to her pit boss, and he continued to play craps at her table. At first, he made small talk, as if they were old friends. But Sunny kept her composure, and the moment they were alone at the table, she warned him to leave and told him that she had a new boyfriend who was very protective. Before leaving her, he called her a bitch and told her he did not want to see her anyway. A week later, he did show up. Sunny had a feeling he would, and told her new boyfriend, who sat quietly and played slot machines as he kept an eye on her. We don't know his name, but he was a big dude and a Golden Gloves boxer. This time she told her pit boss, and the moment he entered, he was asked to leave. As he left, Sunny's new boo followed him outside to his car, and as he opened his car door, this guy punches Richard full in the neck and slammed him against the car. He kicked him a couple of times, stole his driver's license, and made it clear that now he had enough information about him to hunt him down like a dog and kill him. Richard was told in no uncertain terms that if he ever came near Sunny again in any capacity, he would be beaten to death. For good measure, he kicked him in the ribs a couple more times. Richard is now angrier at Sonny and all women than ever before because his pride had been tainted. On the 4th of December 1991, the naked body of 20-year-old Hannah Curtis was discovered on a vacant lot. As with the previous victims, she had been strangled, beaten, and semen was found on her hair and clothing. She was originally from Bakersfield and had only been in Las Vegas for about 6 months before she met her terrible fate. She quickly met the wrong people, got addicted to crack, and turned to sex work to feed her habit. With her, he originally asked her to pretend to be asleep, but out of the blue, he started to beat her in the face. He strangled, released, until she was done, playing cat and mouse with her vital signs. The following spring, the dead body of Tarana Baker, who was only 19 years old, was discovered on the side of a dirt road. She was a Las Vegas native, and her life was on track until she got into a really bad car accident and got addicted to opiates. No one who knew her knew she was turning to sex work, and everyone was under the impression she was just an average first-year college student. She was also strangled, battered, and raped like his previous victims. This time he nearly got caught, because as he was zipping up his pants, the headlights of a park ranger lit up the area. He raced off, but the ranger got a good description of him and his vehicle, and a bolo was issued. Richard got such a fright, he drove all night to the town of Elko. He had the car cleaned from top to bottom and got rid of the mattress he had in the back of the car and then traded his Suburban in for a Chevy Aster van. He drove back to Las Vegas that same day, and for the next 6 years, he had gotten such a fright that he kept those sick urges of his in check. On the 16th of October 1998, the body of 21-year-old Celia Gonzalez is found in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church, a mile from the Strip. She had no addiction problems and just got involved with a really bad guy who was too lazy to work and who convinced her to turn tricks. She had been a regular on the Strip for about a year. Celia grew up in a religious household, but her boyfriend Rolando had a very long rap sheet and a fierce cocaine addiction. After Richard picked her up, it was the same old story. He beat her to a pulp, strangled, raped her, and then dumped her body. On the 20th of March, 1999, Richard strikes again. Her body would never have been identified, but coroners estimated her age between 16 and 20 years old. He left her battered and bruised body next to the dumpster of a barbecue restaurant. On the 1st of August, the body of 23-year-old Monica Alexander was found under a tree near the Strip. She was discovered by a young mother who had taken her kids to play in the park. Monique left 2 young children behind, one only 3 and a daughter of only 1 year old. Those who knew her said that despite her troubles, she was a great mother and would do anything for her children, which is why she would walk the Strip on and off for 5 years. She had once been a flight attendant but got addicted to opiates, and from that point on, her life just kept on sliding down the gutter. This time Richard had left his victim completely naked and in the open for anyone to see and find. Her nipple had been bitten hard enough to break the skin. In December 2000, Richard's next victim would be found in a park near the Strip. 18-year-old Tiffany Davenport had only been in Las Vegas for a couple of months. According to her parents, she got good grades, but she had dreams of becoming a performer. She was a good dancer and a good gymnast, but had no idea of how to make this dream come true. She soon ran out of cash and met a girl who was a sex worker, and the rest, as they say, is history. The night of the 29th of December was the first and only night she would try sex work, and unfortunately for her, Richard Byrd was her first and only customer. This time the violence had escalated, and he beat her viciously. He came on her and inside her, and he had bitten her left breast so hard that a chunk of flesh was missing when her body was discovered. Now a task force was formed, led by Detective Tony Hurton. He remembered that Andy Bowen had suspicions of a serial killer and called him up. The two compared notes and were certain they were looking for the same suspect. On the 10th of July 2001, another body is discovered. Natalie Gaines was a 16-year-old runaway from Texas who had only been in Las Vegas for about 3 weeks before her roads crossed with Richard Byrd. Natalie had been struggling with mental illness and had been diagnosed with bipolar, and she had been sexually assaulted at 13 years old by a male relative. She had a lot of problems at home and at school, and when her body was found, she was already 6 weeks pregnant. The father of the baby was never identified. Richard took her to Baker's Park, beat her, strangled her, and bit both of her breasts. Her body had numerous lacerations. On the 9th of September 2001, 20-year-old Emma Martins climbed into Richard Byrd's van. Richard drove them to a secluded part of the park, and once again he wanted to live out the fantasy he had been carrying in his demented mind, but this time things would not go well for him. Emma was in a dark place in her life and desperate for money, but she was clean for about a month. She had been living on the street, but before her life spiraled out of control, she had obtained a black belt in mixed martial arts. She felt something was off with this guy, and when he told her to close her eyes and pretend to be asleep, she held her guard up. When he went to punch her, she moved her head just enough for it to be a glancing blow. The tiny woman then threw her knee with all her might straight into Richard's nuts. He tried to push through the pain and go for her throat, but she punched him twice in his throat, and she used a hip thrust to flip him over. So she was on top, and she rains down blows on his face and throat like a ninja. She continued to scream as she attacked him and pulled him by his feet out of the van. She then stomped on his dick and nuts. A park ranger by the name of Omar Collins hears her cries and came to her aid, and pretty soon Andy Hodder is called. They let Byrd stew in a jail cell for a day. As the detectives connect the dots, he becomes more and more certain he has his serial killer. During the interrogation, Richard tried for about 10 minutes to deny he killed the 8 sex workers, but the moment the death penalty was put on the table, he confessed, and a month later, in October, he would plead guilty to all the charges. He is sentenced to 8 life sentences and an additional 30 years for the attack on Emma Martins. His capture hardly makes the news, as people are still in shock from the 9/11 attacks and because he took a plea deal instead of a trial. On the 13th of May 2005, Richard got married in prison. Her name was Joanna Knox. They would divorce a year later, stating irreconcilable differences. He apparently divorced her because he was under the impression that they would have conjugal visits. On the 1st of April 2007, Richard Byrd died during an operation to repair a ruptured colon. Believe it or not, he got hold of a hairbrush in prison and ended up sticking it so far up his asshole that he tore his intestines. I kid you not. Officers found him butt naked, bleeding from his anus on the floor, and though he would survive the emergency surgery, a bacterial infection would eventually be the cause of his death. This might be one of the strangest cases about a serial killer I have ever written about, and frankly, after I close my laptop, I am going to have a stiff drink, because it really disturbs me that people like Richard Byrd are able to fly so low under the radar and be so little known of. Before you pour yourself a stiff one, remember to do those tedious things like subscribe, write a review, and give us 5 stars. Because in the world of podcasting, the algorithm is king, and you guys know how hard we work and keep on coming back for more. This episode was written by Misdemeanor. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.